For a brief moment, the Pacific sky appeared calm and undisturbed, stretching endlessly without movement or warning. Japanese pilots scanned the horizon with practiced confidence, convinced that control of the air meant knowing what could be seen. What they did not yet understand was that the most dangerous change in the war was not visible at all, and that the empty sky above them was already filled with unseen intent. During the early months of the Pacific War, Japanese air power relied heavily on one assumption that had proven reliable in earlier conflicts. If the sky appeared clear, it was safe. Pilots were trained to trust their eyes, to read distance, light, and movement, and to believe that awareness itself was protection. This belief shaped tactics, formations, and expectations at every level of Japanese air operations. At the same time, American forces were quietly abandoning that assumption. They were learning that air superiority no longer depended on constant visibility, but on positioning, timing, and surprise. The sky was becoming something new, a space where absence could conceal danger rather than prevent it. The moment Japanese pilots began to realize this change, the balance of air combat in the Pacific started to shift. Japanese pilots entered the Pacific War with a sense of assurance that had been built long before the first shots were fired. Their training emphasized awareness, discipline, and a mastery of visual observation. Hours were spent learning how to scan the horizon efficiently, how to judge distance against cloud formations, and how to identify threats by subtle changes in light or movement. The sky, to them, was not chaotic, it was readable. This confidence was reinforced during the early stages of the war. Initial encounters often confirmed what pilots believed to be true. Enemy aircraft were frequently detected visually before they could pose serious danger, and victories came quickly. The absence of enemy planes became associated with dominance rather than vulnerability. An empty sky meant that control had already been established. Operational planning reflected this mindset. Patrol routes, fuel consumption, and engagement strategies were calculated under the assumption that threats would reveal themselves through sight. Japanese formations often flew with the expectation that visual contact was the primary signal for action. If nothing appeared on the horizon, there was little reason to anticipate immediate danger. This belief shaped behavior in subtle ways. Pilots grew accustomed to scanning wide areas with confidence rather than urgency. Formation leaders relied on what they could see directly, trusting that their experience would compensate for any unseen variables. The sky was treated as an open space, one that rewarded vigilance but punished only carelessness. What Japanese pilots could not yet see was that this very confidence was becoming a weakness. American forces were studying these patterns carefully, recognizing that predictability in expectation could be exploited. The empty sky, once a symbol of control, was about to become a carefully prepared illusion. By the time Japanese pilots began to encounter situations that contradicted everything they had been trained to trust, the change was already well underway. While Japanese pilots continued to rely on visual certainty, the nature of the Pacific War was quietly shifting beneath them. American forces were absorbing early losses and transforming them into lessons, focusing less on how battles had been fought before and more on how they could be fought differently. The sky, once treated as a shared and visible battlefield, was becoming something more complex and far less predictable. American air doctrine began to emphasize control through timing rather than presence. Aircraft were no longer expected to patrol endlessly or announce themselves through constant visibility. Instead, pilots were trained to wait, to position themselves carefully, and to strike only when conditions favored surprise. The goal was not to fill the sky, but to dominate critical moments within it. This shift was subtle and difficult to detect. Japanese pilots did not suddenly face overwhelming numbers or obvious changes in enemy behavior. What they encountered instead were moments of confusion, situations where expectations failed without clear explanation. Flights that should have been routine suddenly turned dangerous, not because the enemy was stronger, but because the enemy was unseen until it was too late. American pilots learned to use altitude as concealment. By remaining above expected visual ranges, they avoided detection until the final seconds of engagement. Approaches were planned carefully, often using cloud layers or the position of the sun to mask movement. Attacks came from angles that traditional visual scanning did not prioritize, exploiting the natural limitations of human perception. Japanese formations continued to fly confidently through areas they believed were uncontested. The absence of visible aircraft reinforced the assumption that airspace was clear. Yet American fighters were often already in position, waiting patiently rather than revealing themselves prematurely. The sky had become a space where danger was no longer announced, but concealed. This created a growing mismatch between expectation and reality. Japanese pilots trusted that careful observation would give them time to react. American tactics were designed specifically to remove that time. The moment of visual contact was no longer the beginning of a fight. It was often the end of one. As these encounters accumulated, patterns began to emerge, though not immediately. Pilots reported surprise attacks that seemed to come from nowhere, describing skies that had appeared empty moments before engagement. These reports were unsettling, but difficult to interpret. There was no single enemy tactic to point to, no obvious technological explanation that could be easily addressed. What was changing was not simply how the Americans flew, but how they thought about the sky itself. To them, invisibility was no longer a limitation. It was an advantage. The absence that Japanese pilots found reassuring was becoming the very condition that allowed American aircraft to control the fight. By the time Japanese commanders began to sense that something fundamental had shifted, the psychological balance of air combat was already moving against them. The sky had not changed in appearance, but it had changed in purpose, and those who continued to trust it blindly were the first to suffer the consequences. There came a point in the Pacific War when Japanese pilots began to experience something more disturbing than enemy fire. It was the growing realization that their own senses were no longer reliable. The horizon, once a trusted reference, started to betray them. Skies that appeared clear and predictable suddenly became the source of danger itself. Many encounters followed a similar pattern. Japanese pilots would conduct careful visual sweeps, checking altitude, cloud cover, and the line where sky met sea. Everything appeared calm. There were no contrails, no glints of metal, no movement to suggest the presence of hostile aircraft. In those moments, confidence returned, reinforced by years of experience and training. Then, without warning, the sky erupted. American fighters appeared suddenly, often diving from higher altitudes or emerging from cloud cover with devastating speed. Tracers cut through the air from directions that had not been considered threats. The moment of realization came not with distant shapes on the horizon, but with the immediate shock of engagement. These encounters were deeply disorienting. Japanese pilots had not been careless. They had done exactly what their training demanded. The sky had been observed, the horizon scanned, and the airspace judged to be clear. Yet the enemy had been present all along, hidden not by invisibility, but by expectation. The psychological impact of these moments was significant. Pilots began to question their own judgment, replaying encounters in their minds and searching for signs they might have missed. Confidence, once a natural part of flight, became something that had to be forced. Every clear horizon now carried the possibility of deception. American pilots understood this effect and exploited it deliberately. Attacks were timed to minimize warning, striking at moments when Japanese pilots felt most secure. Altitude was used as a shield, and positioning was calculated to take advantage of blind spots in visual scanning. The sky was no longer a neutral space. It was an environment shaped by perception and misdirection. As reports accumulated, a troubling pattern emerged. The most dangerous moments were no longer those filled with visible threats, but those marked by apparent calm. The empty sky, once reassuring, became a source of anxiety. Pilots learned that danger no longer announced itself through sight alone. This shift marked a turning point in air combat psychology. The horizon could no longer be trusted as a warning system. What it showed was no longer the full truth. Japanese pilots were being forced to confront a new reality, one in which the absence of visible danger was not safety, but uncertainty. By the time this lesson became unavoidable, the cost had already been paid in lost aircraft and shattered confidence. The sky had not changed, but the way it deceived had become clear, and there was no easy way to undo that realization. As the pattern of sudden encounters continued, Japanese pilots began to experience a shift that was more psychological than tactical. The sky, once a familiar and dependable environment, became a place of constant doubt. What had previously inspired confidence now demanded suspicion. Every flight carried an unspoken question. Was the danger truly absent or simply unseen? This uncertainty affected pilots in subtle but powerful ways. Visual scanning became more intense, yet less reassuring. Longer moments were spent searching the horizon, not because something was seen, but because nothing was seen. Silence itself became unsettling. The absence of movement no longer signaled control, but raised the possibility of deception. Decision-making suffered under this pressure. Pilots hesitated before committing to maneuvers, unsure whether an unseen threat might already be positioned above or behind them. Formation leaders found it harder to maintain cohesion, as individuals reacted differently to the same empty sky. Some became overly cautious, while others tried to maintain confidence through denial. American forces recognized this hesitation and learned to exploit it further. The effectiveness of surprise was no longer measured only in aircraft destroyed, but in confidence eroded. Each unexpected engagement reinforced the idea that Japanese pilots could not trust their own perception, turning the sky into a psychological battlefield. Training manuals and tactical adjustments could not easily address this problem. The issue was not a single maneuver or piece of equipment, but a fundamental change in how air combat functioned. The sky no longer revealed intent through visibility alone. It concealed it. Pilots began to describe the sky differently in reports and debriefings. What had once been described as clear or open was now referred to with caution. Terms that implied uncertainty replaced those that implied control. The language of confidence was slowly giving way to the language of doubt. This change had long-term consequences. Confidence, once a decisive advantage in air combat, became fragile. American pilots, operating with the expectation of surprise rather than visibility, grew more comfortable in this environment. Japanese pilots, trained to trust what they could see, were forced to adapt to a reality where sight was no longer sufficient. The sky had become unpredictable, not because it was chaotic, but because it was no longer honest. What appeared to offer could not be trusted, and that realization lingered long after each encounter ended. By the later stages of the Pacific Air War, the idea of an empty sky had taken on an entirely different meaning for Japanese pilots. What once represented control and safety had transformed into a warning sign, a space where danger could exist without revealing itself. Absence was no longer neutral. It had become deliberate, calculated, and deeply unsettling. American air tactics now relied heavily on this transformation. Pilots were trained to resist the instinct to reveal their presence prematurely. Instead of seeking immediate engagement, they waited patiently, positioning themselves where the enemy least expected them to be. The sky was used not as a stage, but as a veil. What could not be seen became more powerful than what could. Japanese pilots, meanwhile, found themselves flying in a state of constant vigilance that drained both confidence and focus. The need to question every clear horizon placed an invisible burden on decision-making. Flights that had once felt routine now carried an underlying tension, as pilots struggled to determine whether calm conditions were genuine or deceptive. This shift had operational consequences. Escorts flew tighter formations. Patrols consumed more fuel as pilots extended their scans, and engagement decisions became more conservative. Each of these adjustments, though logical in isolation, reduced flexibility and responsiveness. The very act of preparing for unseen threats limited the ability to react when those threats finally appeared. American forces exploited these limitations with precision. Surprise attacks were timed to moments when Japanese pilots felt most secure, reinforcing the association between calm skies and sudden danger. Each successful engagement deepened the psychological impact, turning absence into a recurring source of fear rather than reassurance. What made this transformation so effective was its subtlety. There was no single moment when Japanese pilots could say that the sky had changed. Instead, the realization emerged gradually, shaped by repeated experiences that contradicted everything they had been taught to trust. The sky looked the same, yet behaved differently, and there was no clear way to reconcile the two. By the end of the war, air combat doctrine had been fundamentally altered. Control of the sky was no longer defined by constant presence or visual dominance. It was defined by the ability to shape perception, to decide when and how the enemy would become aware of danger. The empty sky, once a symbol of safety, had become a carefully managed illusion. For Japanese pilots, this realization came at a heavy cost. Confidence, once their greatest strength, had been eroded by uncertainty. The sky they had trusted now demanded caution, and the lessons learned in those encounters would echo long after the final flights were flown. By the time the Pacific War reached its later stages, the sky had lost its original meaning for Japanese pilots. What had once been a familiar and dependable space became an environment filled with uncertainty, shaped not by what could be seen, but by what might already be there. The transformation was not sudden, nor was it marked by a single battle or technological breakthrough. It unfolded quietly, through repeated encounters that slowly dismantled the belief held at the very core of Japanese air doctrine. The most significant change was not tactical, but psychological. Japanese pilots had entered the war trusting that awareness equaled safety, and that control of the sky could be measured through visibility alone. When that assumption failed, they left behind more than lost aircraft. It created doubt. Every clear horizon now carried the memory of surprise, and every calm stretch of sky hinted at unseen danger. Confidence, once instinctive, had to be manufactured, and even then it remained fragile. American forces understood the power of this shift. By redefining how control of the air was achieved, they turned expectation itself into a weapon. The sky did not need to be crowded to be dangerous. It only needed to be misunderstood. Timing, altitude, and patience proved more decisive than constant presence, and invisibility became as valuable as firepower. The battlefield moved from the visible to the perceptual, where hesitation could be induced long before contact was made. For Japanese pilots, adaptation was difficult and often incomplete. Training, experience, and courage remained, but the environment in which those qualities had once thrived had changed fundamentally. The sky no longer offered clear answers. It demanded caution where confidence had once been rewarded, and it punished reliance on patterns that no longer applied. The realization that absence could conceal intent forced pilots to question not only their surroundings, but their own judgment. This story is not defined by a single aircraft, tactic, or engagement. It is defined by a shift in how war was understood in the air. The Pacific sky remained vast and unchanged in appearance, yet its role in combat was transformed. What mattered most was no longer what could be seen, but what could be anticipated, delayed, and revealed at precisely the wrong moment. When the war ended, the lesson endured. Air combat would never again rely solely on visibility or presence. The empty sky had proven itself capable of deception, and those who learned to exploit that truth reshaped the future of aerial warfare. Four Japanese pilots who had once trusted the horizon completely, the realization came too late. The sky they believed was empty had never truly been so, and it never would be again. If you enjoyed this documentary and want to discover more untold stories from World War II, make sure to subscribe to WW2 Chronicle Vault. Your support helps us bring history back to life, one forgotten story at a time.